The rain came down in sheets that night, like the sky itself was weeping for every lost soul on the Montana frontier. Lightning cracked across the black clouds, and thunder shook the hills as if the whole world was angry. And there, soaked to the bone on the muddy roadside, lay a young woman who had nothing left but the clothes on her back and a heart full of broken dreams. Silas McCoy rode his old mare through the storm, his hat pulled low and his lantern swinging wildly in the wind. He was a lone rancher, 32 years old, tall and strong with calloused hands from years of hard work. His small cabin sat 3 miles from the nearest town of Willow Creek, and he liked the quiet life. No wife, no family, just the cattle, the grass, and the wide Montana sky. People brought trouble, he always said, but when his lantern light fell on the crumpled figure beside the trail, something inside his lonely chest shifted. He slid down from the saddle fast, boots sinking into the mud. "Miss, can you hear me?" he called over the roar of the rain. The woman lifted her head just enough for him to see her pale face, wet curls sticking to her cheeks, and wide, frightened blue eyes. "Please, I have nowhere to go," she whispered, her voice weak like a dying wind. Then her head dropped again. Silas did not think twice. He wrapped her in his thick coat, lifted her gently onto the mare, and rode home as fast as the storm allowed. Inside the warm cabin, he lit the stove, gave her dry clothes from his mother's old trunk, and made hot coffee. She slept for 2 days straight. On the 3rd morning, sitting by the fire with a blanket around her thin shoulders, she told him her name, Faith Thompson. She spoke slowly, her voice still shaky. She had come all the way from Ohio because a smooth-talking man named Harlan Reed had promised her marriage and a fine ranch life. For months he had sent her letters full of sweet words and dreams, how he would build her a house with a big porch, how they would watch sunsets together. Faith, who had lost her parents young and worked hard in a laundry, believed every word. She sold her few things, bought a stagecoach ticket, and traveled for weeks across rivers and plains. When she stepped off in Montana, Harlan was waiting at the stop, but only long enough to take her small bag of money and her trust. That same night she learned the truth from a kind stranger. Harlan already had a wife and 3 children in the next valley. He had lied to many girls before. With no money left and nowhere to turn, Faith had walked for days, sleeping under trees, eating wild berries, until the terrible rain and exhaustion finally dropped her on Silas's lonely road. Silas listened without interrupting, his gray eyes steady. When she finished, tears on her cheeks, he simply nodded and said, "You can stay in the spare room. Long as you need, no questions asked." At first, Faith moved like a scared shadow, afraid he would change his mind and send her away. She barely spoke, kept her eyes down. But little by little, the cabin began to feel alive. She swept the wooden floors until they shone like new. She cooked simple, warm meals, thick bean soup, fresh cornbread baked in the iron skillet, and the rabbit Silas brought home, seasoned with wild sage and thyme she found behind the barn. One bright morning, Silas came back from checking the cattle and stopped in surprise. A little patch of bright yellow flowers was blooming right by the front door. Faith had planted them with a handful of seeds she had carried all the way from Ohio in her pocket. "You made it look like a real home," Silas said quietly one evening, watching her stir the stew on the stove. The smell of bread and coffee filled the air. Faith looked up and smiled for the first time, a small, shy smile that lit her whole face. "It feels like one now, Mr. McCoy. Thank you." Days turned into weeks, and the cabin grew warmer. They started talking more after supper. Silas told her about losing his parents to fever when he was just a boy, how he'd built the ranch alone with his own 2 hands, and how the long winters sometimes made him feel the silence too deep. Faith told him about her little sister back in Ohio, about the dreams she once had of open skies, honest work, and a man who would never lie. Every night they sat on the old wooden porch, rocking in creaky chairs, listening to the crickets and the soft wind in the tall prairie grass. Silas began leaving small, quiet gifts for her, a clean blue handkerchief when he saw her crying over old memories, extra firewood neatly stacked by the door, and a thin book of poetry he bought in town just 'cause he remembered she liked pretty words. Faith started looking at him with soft, trusting eyes, and Silas felt his quiet heart opening like the yellow flowers she cared for every morning. But trouble has a way of riding into even the quietest places on the frontier. One dusty afternoon, the town gossip reached the ranch like a bad wind. Mrs. Parker from the general store rode up in her buggy, her sharp eyes full of worry. "Silas, folks in Willow Creek are saying that girl of yours was mixed up in the bank robbery last month. They say she arrived right when the safe was cracked open. Sheriff's asking questions all over town. You best be careful. She might bring danger to your door." Silas's jaw tightened like iron. Faith had nothing to do with it. She's honest as the day long. Still, the rumors spread fast. Men in the saloon whispered over their whiskey that the stranger woman with no past must be hiding something. Women at church gave Faith cold stares when she went to town for flour. 2 days later, the sheriff himself came riding up, hat in hand, boots dusty. "Miss Thompson, I need to ask you a few things down at the office," he said, politely but firm. Faith stood pale but straight as a pine tree. She answered every question honestly in her soft voice. No, she had never been near the bank. Yes, she had walked from the stagecoach stop with nothing but her feet. No, she had no gold or money hidden anywhere. When the sheriff left, she turned to Silas with tears shining in her eyes. "I should go tonight," she said, voice breaking. "I won't bring shame or trouble to you. You've been kinder than any man I've ever known, Silas. I can't repay you by ruining your good name." Silas stepped close, gently took her trembling hands in his rough ones, and looked straight into her eyes. "I believe you, Faith, with all my heart. You stay right here. This cabin is yours now, too, if you want it to be." She stayed, though fear kept her awake some nights. 3 long weeks later, the real robbers were caught 20 miles away, 2 rough men from the next territory, with the stolen gold still hidden in their saddlebags. The sheriff rode straight to the ranch at sunset, smiling wide. "Miss Thompson, the town owes you a big apology. We were dead wrong. Those men confessed everything." The very next day, people started coming to the cabin with gifts, baskets of fresh bread, jars of wild berry jam, and kind words. The same women who had spread the rumors now called her Dear Faith and asked for cuttings from her bright flower garden. Children waved at her when she walked into town. Faith smiled politely and thanked them all, but her eyes kept finding Silas full of quiet thanks. One quiet evening, after the last visitor had gone home, Faith stood alone by the warm hearth. She pulled out the small bundle of letters Harlan had sent her, the ones full of lies and empty promises that once made her believe in love. One by one, she fed them into the fire. The paper curled, turned black, and became nothing but soft ash. Silas watched from the doorway, his tall frame blocking the moonlight. "Feels good to let go of the past, doesn't it?" he asked gently. Faith nodded, tears of peace on her cheeks. From her small cloth bag she took out only 3 things and laid them carefully on the wooden table. First, the faded blue handkerchief Silas had given her the stormy night he found her.
Second, a single pressed yellow flower from the patch she had planted, the very first one that had bloomed under her care. Third, a small scrap of paper where she had written one simple word in her careful, pretty handwriting: home. She looked up at Silas, her voice soft but strong and sure. "I don't need anything else from my old life. This is where I belong now, with you." Silas crossed the room in 2 steps and took her hands. For the first time in many lonely years, the quiet rancher smiled like a man who had finally found his future. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the tall grass, and inside the little cabin, 2 hearts that had been broken by the world finally beat together as one. And from that night on, whenever travelers passed the ranch at the edge of the valley, they saw bright yellow flowers dancing by the door and heard warm laughter drifting through the open windows. They said the place was no longer just a lonely cabin. It had become a true home, built by a stormy night, simple trust, and a love that refused to be washed away by rain or rumors. Thank you for riding along on this story. Drop your location and time one more time if you'd like, and if it touched you, like, send some stars, follow, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next tale of courage.